Jilliana Michaels, and in my last video, Junk Journal Journey Part 1, I shared about creating my signatures and how to create some vellum collage fodder. In this video, I'm moving on to the next step, creating the cover and sewing in the signatures. This part of the journey was a bit challenging and at times a little frustrating, but I learned a lot going through the process, so I'm going to do my best to share what I learned along the way. Before I start working on the cover though, I decided to trim the signatures. This is not totally necessary, but I wanted the edges to be flush with each other. Before you begin trimming, you want to make sure the papers are lined up and pushed toward the fold. I'm tapping the signatures to help push the papers down into the fold, and then I'm using a clip to hold them together. To trim the papers, I'm using a cutting mat, a metal-edged ruler, and a craft knife. Place the ruler along the edge of the top paper, and then I'm using the craft knife to cut away the excess. I'm not pushing super hard. I just made sure to have a new sharp blade, and then I continue to move the blade along the edge of the ruler until I'm all the way through the papers. I'm anxious to try the new Tim Holtz rotary paper trimmer, as I think it would probably cut through these like butter. I tried my guillotine cutter, but it struggled a little bit because of the thickness. So for now, I'm going to stick with the craft knife option. And I'm using that old cutting mat because I tried to save the black one so it looks good for my videos. So now onto the cover, which I'm going to make out of a piece of thick chipboard. To help determine what size I want the cover, I'm using a T ruler to measure the width of the signatures, which is 5 inches, and I'm going to add a 1/4 inch so that it will be 5 1/4 inches wide. And I need a front and a back cover, so I measure over another 5 1/4 inches to get the back cover. This piece of chipboard is 8.5 by 11, so I have plenty to make my entire cover, including the spine. The signature is 6 inches tall, so I'm going to make the cover 6.5 inches, which gives me a 1/4 inch on the top and bottom. Here you can see how thick the chipboard is. After cutting this, I would probably recommend using thinner chipboard, cutting multiple pieces and gluing them together to make it more sturdy. If you don't have chipboard, you could also use cereal boxes. Since this is an adventure, I'm taking you along with all the things I attempt, and I try to cut the chipboard with my craft knife, and well, that does not work. The ruler ends up sliding, so I end up getting a box cutter from my husband's toolbox, and then I'm in business. I'm not pushing super hard, and once I get it started with a few slices, I can even move the ruler out of the way and just use the cut lines to guide the remaining cuts. Each pass cuts deeper until I'm all the way through. This long strip that I cut off will be perfect for the spine, which will be 6.5 inches by 2 inches. Off camera, I'm going to repeat the process of cutting the chipboard to create both of the covers and the spine. Now that I have the pieces cut, it's time to move on to the next step of covering my junk journal with some sort of material, such as paper or fabric. After trying to figure out what I wanted to use, I decided to use collage paper. This decision was mostly based on the fact that I don't have any fabric and I don't have any paper that is large enough to cover both the front and back and be the same paper. Here I'm just rolling out the collage paper and deciding what section I want to show on the front cover. One of the things I learned as I was trying to learn more about making junk journals was the importance of keeping track of the front, back, and top of each piece as you're assembling the journal. So here I'm making some marks to try to help me do that. To adhere the collage paper, I'm using Distress Collage Medium and a brush to apply it. Once you lay the paper down and press it into the adhesive, you can't really move it, so keep that in mind as you start to position the paper. I was able to lift it up here and there to remove some goobers and slightly reposition it. When you are positioning the paper, make sure to leave enough room to hang over the top, bottom, and right-hand side, as you will fold that over later on to cover the edges. And if you get any wrinkles in the paper, don't worry about that. I kind of wish I had thought about adding some when I was adhering the paper, as I think it would have added some fun texture. Here I'm trimming off the excess that I'm using for the back cover and then setting the piece to the side to dry. Now I'm just repeating the same process with the back cover. While the back cover is drying, I'm going to cover the edges of the front cover. I'm applying more of the collage medium, and then I'm lifting up the cover, pushing down and using the pressure to help mold the paper around the edge. I'm going to repeat this process for the bottom edge, but first I'm going to trim off some of the excess. Now onto the corners. Where the top and bottom pieces are folded over, I'm going to kind of push the paper up into the fold and then use the adhesive to adhere everything in place. This is where the collage paper ended up being a great choice. Because it's so thin, making the corners look neat and pretty is super easy. There are lots of ways out there to do this, but for now I really like this method and how neat the corners look, so I'll try it again in the future with either fabric or paper and see how it goes. After I've finished the corners, I've repeated the lift, push, and fold over to cover the side edge. I then repeated everything on the other side of the cover. If you want to save a little time, you could skip this part on that side that goes into the spine and just trim off the excess paper. After I finished the front cover, I repeated the same process for the back cover. I then decided the cover looked a little too plain, so I thought I'd try distressing it. Here I'm spraying old paper spray stain directly onto the paper, spritzing it with some water, and then smearing and dabbing the ink around with my fingers. I decided to add some splatters of vintage photo and do a little more finger painting. I also added a little more old paper just for good measure. Here I'm using my heat tool to dry the ink. I have to say I really liked the finished look once it was completely dry. Now I need to do something to make the inside of the cover look nice, and for this I'm going to use pattern paper. As I'm going through my stash, I picked this piece as it's somewhat neutral in color and won't compete with the signatures or the cover. The paper is also just the right size at 6 inches to create a nice little border around the top, bottom, and outside edge from where the collage paper wraps around. In this spot though, I'm a little short. Thankfully, I can just add a little extra collage paper and fill in the blank space. Here I'm adhering a little strip with collage medium. This is the same adhesive I used earlier, it's just in a bottle, which is easier to deal with for such a small application. As I mentioned earlier, the paper is already the right height, and I needed it to be 5 inches wide, so I'm going to cut it down to size with my paper trimmer. Now I have 2 pieces of paper that are 6 by 5 inches. Here I'm inking the edges with some walnut stain distressing to add to the vintage feel of things. To adhere this paper, I'm going to try a new to me adhesive that is made for bookbinding. It's by Lynette Co. and it's a PVA adhesive with a neutral pH that is archival and won't yellow with age, and it dries clear. So this is not your child's Elmer glue. The instructions say to shake it well and then apply it. Of course, I'm being lazy and using my finger to smear it around, and I have to say it was surprisingly gentle on my skin and washed off easily even after it had dried. It didn't wrinkle this particular paper. It dried relatively quickly and clear. I also didn't notice any odor, so all in all, I'm quite happy with it. On the second panel, I remembered to pull out my bone folder to smooth out the paper. This also caused some of the excess adhesive to squish out. I'm just wiping it away with a paper towel, but I'm sure you could also use a baby wipe. So now we're on to the spine. I came across several ways of doing this, including using bookbinding tape, Tyvek tape, and duct tape. The Tyvek and duct tape are much less expensive and can be found at any hardware store. And if you're going to cover your spine with paper or fabric, it doesn't really matter what sort of tape you use. You can probably skip the tape if you use fabric. You just need something that can tolerate the repeated opening and closing of the journal, and any of these options will work for that. With regards on how big to make the spine, I probably went a little overboard for the number of signatures, as mine is 2 inches wide. I just know that my journal will end up thick because I like to mention. Here I've placed my 4 signatures into the journal just to see about the spacing, and I decide to go big or go home and leave the spine at 2 inches. Next, I'm going to adhere the bookbinding tape. You want to leave about a 1/4 inch between the covers and the spine so that you can easily open and close the journal. As I'm adhering the tape, I'm using the guidelines on my cutting mat to help me line it up straight. I'll admit this part was a little more than frustrating because it was tricky trying to line things up and keep the tape from sticking to everything. I'm thinking that if the tape was either wide enough to go all the way across, or if it was more narrow and it didn't overlap, That would probably have made things a little easier. In the future, I may try a different method for covering the spine. After joining everything together on the outside, I'm moving on to the inside and I repeat the same process. Here I'm using my bone folder to smooth everything out and make sure the tape is adhered well. Now you can see what it looks like fully assembled. We have us a junk journal, people. One last thing here, if you're worried about the collage paper not holding up, feel free to add a coat of collage medium to seal everything. Before I continue, I want to share about this bookbinding kit I purchased. It has all the basic supplies you need for bookbinding. It's got an awl, a bone folder, different types of needles, a thimble, wax thread in 6 different colors, a brush for applying adhesive, and some clips to help hold things together. Next up, I'm going to sew in the signatures, and I'll just warn you now, there may have been a few choice words here and there during this part of my junk journal journey. After I settled on which thread color to use, it was time to start making the holes. I pulled out this super old foam pad that I thought might be helpful for poking into. If you don't have this or can't find something like it, you might look into buying a piece of thick craft foam. Just something to kind of protect your worktop. I won't, however, be using this method or the pad in the future, and I'll be sharing more about that later. To help me know where to make the holes for sewing in the signatures, I created a template using a piece of graph paper. This particular paper has inches on one side and metric on the other. I actually chose to use the metric side because of the spacing I wanted. I have 4 signatures, and to get them evenly spaced, the graph on the metric side worked out perfectly. I made a dot every 2 spaces, and I'm going to use what is referred to as a 3-hole pamphlet stitch to bind the papers together into the spine. I left about an inch from the top and the bottom of the spine, and then made another hole in the middle. I placed my template along the spine and then took the awl and started poking my holes. This awl is super sharp and went right through the thick cardboard I used. I was actually surprised at how easy it poked through. When I flipped the cover over though, I knew the holes needed to be a little larger, so I poked them again to do that. I will find out later on that they are still not quite large enough. Now it's time to organize the signatures and make sure I know what order I want them placed inside the journal and which side is up. This only matters if you have printed papers or something on the pages that matter how they are viewed. You also want to make sure the inside pages are where you want them and nested together before you start poking holes as well. I check this with each signature and then use a clip to hold them together. In the future, I'll be using large paper clips to hold them in place. I was just using what I had on hand, but these clips are kind of bulky and end up getting in the way when I later try to lay the papers flat. Next, I'm going to mark where to poke the holes on the signatures. I'm taking the signature and centering it on my template. In the future, I will make a mark at the top and bottom of the template for where to line up each signature, so that I get each one lined up exactly in the same spot. I then just use a pencil to mark where each hole is and repeat this for each signature. Before I start making holes, I double check that everything is lined up, and I end up adding an extra clip to better help hold the papers together. Again, I think large paper clips might be a little easier to deal with, but I was just using what I had on hand. The pencil marks were also a little hard to see, so in the future I'll be using a black marker to make a small dot. I then just repeat this process for each signature. Now that the signatures are all situated, I need to cut my thread. A general rule of thumb is to cut it 3 times the length of the journal height. So 1, 2, 3, and then cut. I then just use that length to cut the remaining 3 for a total of 4 pieces, 1 for each signature. To do a pamphlet stitch, you poke through the middle hole on the inside of the signature and then through the middle hole on the spine. Right away, I realize the holes still aren't really big enough, and I'm struggling to push the needle through, even with a smaller needle. So I pull out the awl and attempt to make the holes a little larger, and in the process end up poking my finger. And yes, it hurt. So once the thread is through the middle hole, I want to make sure to leave a little of the thread hanging out as I pull it through the hole. Then from the back side, I poke the needle and thread through the top hole of the spine and the signatures and pull it through to the inside. While I'm doing all this, I have to remember to make sure that I keep hold of the tail I left hanging. If I let go, it's not the end of the world, but I would have to start over with the sewing. Once through, I flip everything over and go down to the bottom hole and go through it and through to the back side again. Once I'm on the back side, I poke it through the middle hole and try not to go through the thread. Now that I'm through, I place each tail so that one is on each side of the center thread. I gently pull the thread to even things up. When you pull on the thread, you want to get the slack out of it, but not pull so tight that it tears the paper. Just go slow and pull gently. After doing this, I was ready to tie a knot, right over left and then left over right to secure it tightly. Here's also where I remember that I forgot to decorate the inside of the spine, either with some ink or paint or something, so it wouldn't be so stark white. I end up adding some walnut stain distress ink using a foam blending tool just to make it a little less stark. I also end up applying the ink to the outside of the spine as well. I would highly recommend doing this before you start sewing in the signatures. And I guess I also could have cut this one out and started over, but oh well. At this point, I'm ready to add the next signature, and the struggles I had with the first one continue with the remaining signatures. The main problem I had was that the holes were just too small, and for me to make them larger with the awl was a challenge because I didn't have anything thicker to poke it into, and I really didn't want to risk injuring myself further. However, at this point, I didn't have another option for making the holes larger, so I continued on with this method. But I knew this would be my last time using the hole poking method. I had seen another option, and as I mentioned, I'll be sharing all about that with you. Another mishap during the process was that I accidentally flipped one of the signatures upside down, and because the holes weren't perfectly centered, it didn't line up with the ones I'd already sewn in, so I had to cut it out and re-sew it. And if that wasn't enough, on one of them I had used a really old book page, and it was a center page, and because the paper was so fragile, it actually cracked in half. So I had to remove the pages, take that one out, and re-sew it. As I mentioned earlier, this stage was super frustrating, but I learned so much that will help me when it comes time to make my next journal. And I hope what I share helps you avoid some of this frustration as well. The other hole poking method I came across and will be using in the future is a good old crocodile. If you aren't familiar with this tool, it is made to punch 1/8 inch and 3/16 inch holes and to set eyelets those sizes. It has a 6-inch reach so it can easily get to the center of a piece of 12 by 12 paper. Another great feature is that it will poke through all kinds of materials, including paper, cardstock, tin, and thin metals, fabric, leather, vinyl, and more. It will also punch this super thick chipboard I'm using. Now that all of the signatures are sewn in place, I decided I wanted to cover the spine. First, I covered the spine with more bookbinding tape. This entire step is not necessary, and if you're okay with being able to see your stitches, then you can totally skip this step. This is also where some fabric would have come in so handy, but I didn't have any, so I decided to use the tape to cover the stitches and just trim it to size and wrap it around the top and bottom edge. I added some more ink to distress things, but I still felt like the spine just looked super boring. I finally came up with adhering this piece of ribbonish stuff that I had in my stash, and I thought it would look good with my cover and add some nice texture to things. Trying to adhere it though was another story. I cut the ribbon to length and adhered it using Beacon 3-in-1, which is the only adhesive I had that was strong enough to do something like this. As you can see, the ribbon wasn't quite wide enough to cover the bookbinding tape, so I decided to add some ribbon to cover the edge using the same adhesive. The Beacon 3-in-1 worked, but this stuff really stinks and it was super messy. I had the adhesive all over my hands and it's not the easiest stuff to wash off once it's dry. So another lesson learned, and I'll be looking into some other options for future fabric adhesive. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. One last thing before I finish this video that I'd wish I'd done before I sewed everything together was to ink the edges of my pages with some walnut stain distress ink. To do this with the pages sewn in and to not get ink where I didn't want it, I placed a scrap piece of cardstock behind the paper and then applied the ink with the ink blending tool. So that's it for part 2. Stay tuned for part 3 as I continue on with my junk journal journey and share how I'll be adding pockets and other ephemera to my journal. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.